take a slightly broader look at film today to discuss an ongoing problem in Hollywood, commonly known as the strong female character, or more specifically, Now, this is hardly the first video that someone has made about the Mary Sue, but in my research for this video, I realized that most content about this subject, it's not very comprehensive, and that the people that make this content are very unwilling to discuss the more distasteful aspects about the problem at large. Even worse is that when a channel does, it's done in the most distasteful ways. Well, not me. I plan on being very honest about what the Mary Sue problem really is, without filling my video with angry vitriol. So let's take a look at the Mary Sue character type and delve into all aspects from its definition and maybe a few ideas of what to do to fix it. The Mary Sue is a modern character archetype that was first coined by Paula Smith in a parody Star Trek fan fiction story that appeared in 1973 in the Star Trek fan magazine, or fanzine, named Menagerie. The idea of the magazine was that it was a place to publish fan short stories, otherwise known as fan fiction, that took place in the Star Trek universe. The parody short story of Mary Sue was the editor's jab at the large number of stories that were being submitted to the magazine for possible publication, where the main character was a strong female that was young, beautiful, good at everything, and beloved by the ship's crew in the most preposterous ways. Sound familiar? By the magazine's 10th issue, the would-be writers still hadn't got the message. Big surprise. So the editors decided to release some guidelines for the prospective authors. Wouldn't you know it? At the top of the list of things the editors asked the writers to refrain from was the Mary Sue archetype. I mean, just how bad was it to be at the top of the list? The editors of the magazine called them placeholder fantasies of the fans writing these stories. In other words, they were personal fantasies or desires with the writer in mind, playing out scenarios or unrealistic daydream-like stories with a more idealized version of the writer as the protagonist. It's like writing out your own fantasy where you're the hero of your own story, you have no flaws, and everybody loves you. The Mary Sue archetype has become the standard issue archetype for female characters today, and almost every single one of them is portrayed as a strong female character with typically masculine traits that succeeds at the expense of the men around them. But that's what we see on screen. What is it really? What is a Mary Sue? It's kind of easy to explain that Mary Sues are just great at everything and that everybody loves them, as stated already, but that's kind of a shallow explanation of what the Mary Sue archetype actually is. A better and more nuanced explanation of the Mary Sue archetype is to understand that it's not actually an archetype at all, but rather that it's a story trope, and that distinction is pretty important. This misunderstanding of the two words is one of the reasons why so many people that defend Mary Sue characters play whataboutism with the hero archetype, which is distinctly not the same thing. And while they may not use the exact phrasing that I am, liberal media definitely thinks that Mary Sues and the hero archetype are the same thing. Let me explain why they're not. Archetypes are timeless and perfect versions of a character type that actually exists in human interactions, that throughout all of human history, these archetypes will exist. There will always be a hero, or a sage, or a caretaker, to give a few examples, in stories because these archetypes are inherent in our own human lives, regardless of space and time. In other words, archetypes exist in stories because they exist in real life. Mary Sues do not. So then the question becomes, what is the difference between this hero and this Mary Sue? What makes this acceptable and this ridiculous? Well, it's not totally gender. I mean, let's face it, that is a part of it, and a much more nuanced problem that most people just don't want to talk about today. It's not even that the Mary Sues are great at everything that they do. That's only 2 ingredients, and it typically takes 3 ingredients to make a Mary Sue. The final ingredient is how the characters in the story interact with the protagonist, and that's what we're going to talk about here. The argument that Luke and Anakin are also Mary Sues is incorrect. The critics that compare Rey to Luke as being the same thing are confusing an archetype with a story trope, and a misunderstanding of those definitions can lead someone to believe that these are actually the same thing. They're not. Luke is a good pilot, strong in the Force, brave, morally good, and a quick learner. These are certainly ingredients to make a Mary Sue, but he isn't one for a number of reasons. One of them is because of the way that the other characters treat him within the story. Luke is often the butt of Han's jokes.
Who's gonna fly it, kid? You?
Slightly ridiculed for his non-opposing size by Leia, or chided by Yoda for his ignorance, for instance.
His mind on where he was. what he was doing.
He makes mistakes often, and on several occasions, Luke can't make it through a movie without needing to be saved, not once, but multiple times. It takes all 3 movies to truly prop Luke up as the hero archetype because the story never treats him like a hero until he's earned it. Consider for a second that instead of being ridiculed by Han, he's actually admired by him. Consider that in every situation Luke finds himself in, where he needs to be saved, he's somehow able to save himself. Imagine that in Luke's first duel with Vader, he beats him with 0 training. Imagine that no matter what's going on, Luke is on the moral high ground and often has to explain why to his ignorant companions while they stand in awe of him. Rey is a very good example of this. She's a better mechanic than Han and Chewie, better at the Force than Anakin and Luke. She's more honest than Finn, a better pilot than just about everyone, better at lightsaber dueling than Kylo Ren, better at killing Palpatine than Vader, more moral than Old Man Luke, and better at being a Skywalker than all the others.
Rey Skywalker.
It just hurts.
I know that hindsight is 20/20, but it's sometimes shocking when looking back at the sequel trilogy just how terrible the writing really was. It's like when they wrote these movies, they started with how amazing at everything Rey was going to be, and then they spent the rest of the time trying to explain how any of the villains in any of these movies could ever actually pose a threat to this goddess amongst mere mortals. The problem with Mary Sue's, discussed at great length all those years ago in Menagerie, is how ridiculous it all seems when compared to well-written content. It always feels so self-serving to the writers, rather than inspiring for the readers, or watchers in this case for movies and
Who
television.
the hell are you? Jennifer Walters, attorney at law.
Like Ron looking in that mirror at Hogwarts, you know what I'm talking about, the one that shows him being head boy and everybody loves him. It's more unrealistic than the fantasy elements around it.
Good.
Okay, enough dancing around the subject. I said I would talk about it, so here it is. There's another component to the Mary Sue, and it's in the moniker itself. Trigger warning, we're gonna talk about gender roles. More often than not, the hero of a hero's journey is male, and that reflects real life. The heroes of stories are written specifically to be identified with by their reader or viewer. In real life, heroic stories of violence, bravery, and incredible strength are more often than not stories where men are the hero. No amount of modern-day feminism has changed the actual facts. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to diminish what women do for society at large. I genuinely believe that they are far more important than men are, in a more chivalrous kind of way.
For the time being, I shall require only women and children.
But do you know what does diminish men's role in society? The unbelievable, unrealistic, and pandering story trope of the Mary Sue. The hero's journey is a male domain, typically because heroics in real life are a male domain. And while the occasional female hero is perfectly acceptable, nearly no one identifies with so many female hero tropes. So yes, there is a gendered component to the Mary Sue. I mean, come on, you think it's an accident that the moniker began with a woman's name? The point is that Star Wars, and most of Hollywood, is nearly unwatchable today. These writers can't seem to make women strong without being at the expense of men, and without making the story filled with pandering fools only placed there to further the message of how great the Mary Sue character is. What was once a story trope that graced its unbelievable and insufferable characters in fan fiction magazines in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and exists today online in forums and in YouTube fan films where such a silly character concept belongs, the Mary Sue now exists in the mainstream. There it is, a nearly 3-page breakdown describing what a Mary Sue actually is. It's not an archetype, because calling it that destroys the definition of archetype. The Mary Sue is a story trope, whose central hero is a nearly perfect woman who is moral, knowledgeable, and capable character that exists in a story where the supporting cast of characters exists only to further the pre-established hero's multifaceted perfection. The trope isn't an archetype because it isn't timeless, and because it requires a pandering supporting cast. Hopefully that helps to clear some things up. But since we've now got the definition down, the next logical question might be, how did we get here?
You did a lot of combat in this movie.
I did it
didn't
all,
know that
yeah.
you were quite. You do punching bags and you do karate kicks on the punching bag. And
I had
whatever.
no idea I was as violent as I guess I am.
Menagerie parody isn't the first time that a female character has had the traits of what we now know as the Mary Sue today, but it is obviously more prominent now than it ever has been. I think a pretty big reason for this complete takeover of insufferable female characters has its roots planted from a more political place like the 60s and the 70s with the mass production of birth control and the Supreme Court decision on Roe v. Wade. The impact that those historic moments had on our culture led to a chain of events popularizing the types of stories our media companies make today. Perhaps even further back than birth control with events like women's suffrage, or maybe even before with the industrialization age of the Western world. But that kind of history lesson is for another video, where perhaps someone can dive deeply into the successes and failures of the feminist movement of the last century and how that's played out in our pop culture and cinema. For now, let's just stick within the confines of Hollywood and its recent history. I think the portrayal of the strong female character trope in modern cinema started to really take hold in the 80s and the 90s and was basically par for the course by the early 2000s. Let me give you an example. When I was growing up, my stay-at-home sick movies that weren't Star Wars always seemed to be action-packed and full of heroes. Die Hard, Lethal Weapon, and Predator are just a few examples, but one movie stood above the rest, and I must have watched this movie almost as much as I did Empire Strikes Back. And that's Aliens. Now don't worry, I'm not gonna knock Ellen Ripley, she's badass, but it started to become obvious that something was changing in 80s movies. Almost all of cinema, up to and through the 1970s, where women were mostly portrayed as characters that are a love interest for the hero or a victim for the antagonists, was starting to shift. Obviously, we had Ellen Ripley in 1979 and we had Princess Leia in 1977, but it was the 80s that truly had widely marketable and interesting female leads, if not somewhat unbelievable. We began to see scenes in movies of women learning how to use a gun, for instance, or drive a car during an intense moment better than expected. The female character might have had a monologue about the difficulties of being a woman, or might have had a scene where the man sits dumbfounded as he's put in his place by the leading actress. It didn't mean that 007 was about to be female or something like that, but that there would be moments throughout the film where a woman would have her time to shine. Aliens is this in spades, having 4 strong female characters, all of which are stronger than the next, like Dietrich, the Marine medic, or Pharaoh, the Marine pilot. Then there's Vasquez, one of the baddest chicks that I've ever seen on screen to this day. Tough, capable, violent, brave, and loyal. I was impressed. It's all a bit unbelievable now when I watch it again.
It is too bad.
But I sure loved this character when I was a kid.
Hey, I'm impressed.
Then there's Ripley. She's smart, pretty, capable, and motherly, and could have easily fit the role that most women did fit prior to the 1970s, but for one minor difference. She kills xenomorphs by the dozens. Female characters were starting to change. And look, maybe it was time to, and maybe there was a legitimate gripe about women only being able to play one role in action films. But looking back, one thing was really clear. Despite how strong these female characters were, they weren't Mary Sue's, not completely at least. They made mistakes, they had flaws, and often needed to be saved and helped by their male counterparts. And in most cases, they had something undeniably feminine about them that helped to round out their character as both hero and damsel. And most importantly, this 80s version of a strong female character was rare. By the time we got to the 90s, however, the strong female character portrayed so well by Ripley and Connor were starting to phase out, along with the macho 80s action hero. Box office hits of the 90s were starting to step away from the overly macho to the seemingly more female approachable stories in movies like Titanic, Jurassic Park, Twister, Ghost, Notting Hill, The Lion King, and Independence Day, just to name a few. These box office titans might have had male leads, but the female characters in these movies were far from being supporting roles, and often they share the screen with their co-stars equally.
God creates dinosaurs. God destroys dinosaurs. God creates man. Man destroys God. Man creates dinosaurs.
Dinosaurs eat man. Woman inherits the earth.
They may not have been full-blown Mary Sues yet, but actresses like Sandra Bullock got their start as a leading actress because of their modern woman dialogue.
If you had read my study, you would know that this is how insecure heterosexual males used to bond.
Alongside their leading male co-stars, while still maintaining their perceived femininity. From Demolition Man and Speed to Miss Congeniality and the Divine Secrets of the Ya-Ya Sisterhood, actresses like Sandra Bullock were the bridge between believable female heroes to unbelievable and insufferable superwomen, a phenomenon that I'm dubbing the Sandra Bullock Bridge. We weren't quite at the full-blown Mary Sue just yet. Women still needed to be saved from time to time, but the male and female actors started to share the screen in most films nearly equally, despite who the hero was supposed to be. It's also a time when many modern political messages made their way into films where the story specifically panders to controversial ideas of the time, like women in the workplace or women's sexual freedom, or even women's right to choose. Things were starting to evolve. The Sandra Bullock Bridge brought us from rare badass women that used their believable and feminine traits to be the hero of the story to right at the door of pure political and female pandering.
Don't go away, because Robotech's coming right back.
But then something happened in the early 2000s that, in my opinion, was the single hardest shift in how female characters were portrayed on screen. This single and massively important event signaled to Hollywood that it was time to put the men in the back seat and let the women take the wheel. Okay, it's hard to properly put into words just how rare and incredible the success of the Harry Potter movies actually was. 8 movies that came out within 10 years, starring child actors, utilizing multiple directors, and competing with the likes of Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, and Marvel. The Harry Potter movies are truly an impressive feat. But right from the beginning, something was introduced that would control the narrative of filmmaking in Hollywood for the next 2 decades. And that's what I'm calling...
You've got dirt on your nose, by the way. Did you know? Just there.
A few months ago, I decided to reread the Harry Potter books for the first time since the last book's release. I was actually pretty excited because I wanted to know how my perspective had changed over the last 16 years. How would I see the characters as an older adult that has that 16 years worth of literature and life experience under my belt? Who would my favorite characters be? How would I feel about the adults in the book now that I'm a father? It was all very interesting to me. Well, I did realize something. Actually, I realized 2 things that changed the way that I looked at the franchise forever. The first thing I realized is, besides the final book, which does feel a little bit rushed, I was amazed at how good the story actually holds up. It is a modern marvel of the hero's journey and has a timeless feel to it that can really only be created through deep understanding of what the hero's journey actually is. Harry Potter is a nearly perfect hero because he's not perfect at all. He's kind of obnoxious, actually, in his decision-making and his emotional behavior. And more often than not, he's a jerk to the people around him. Like young King Arthur, he believes that he's a nobody and the home that he lives in helps to cement this idea and makes him a better man for it. It isn't until Harry, like Arthur, is introduced to the magical world where he is the chosen one that he understands how important everyone seems to think that he is. I honestly had an amazing time rereading these books, but as I was rereading the first book, I realized that something was off that I hadn't quite caught before. Which leads me to the second thing that I noticed. Something in these books just wasn't adding up to the way that I remembered the characters because the last time that I enjoyed anything Harry Potter related, I was watching the movies with my kids. Now, I'm not sure when my last viewing of the Harry Potter movies was prior to having reread the books, but whenever it was, it had a lasting effect on how I perceived the characters. A perception that seemed to supersede my perception of the book versions of the characters. Bringing it back to the point that I'm trying to make, when I finished the first book this time, I remembered something that I hadn't thought about in 2 decades. Ron used to be my favorite character, and I had completely forgotten it. Now, if you've never read the books, then it's hard to understand what I'm talking about because Ron is such a crappy character in the movies. Often, he's petrified of whatever scary situation the trio experiences, and oftentimes, he's the butt of the joke in just about every scene that he clumsily finds himself in. He's not as brave as Harry or Hermione, not as smart, good-looking, popular, charismatic, or even as rich as his counterparts, and the movies work pretty hard to maintain that narrative. The movie version of Ronald Weasley simply just doesn't belong amongst these mighty heroes, but the books are very different in their presentation of Harry's red-headed ally. Ron is oftentimes braver than Harry and far more loyal than Hermione. He's stoic, described as nearly as intelligent as Harry, a good duelist, and is the best friend a guy can have when going up against a villain like Voldemort. Ron is also remarkably humble when considering that he's best friends with the most famous wizard in the wizarding world and also best friends with the smartest student at Hogwarts. It takes 4 years for his humble nature to finally crack from his teenage jealousy, living in the shadow of his family and his peers. Honestly, Ron is a wonderfully written character. He was even polled as most people's favorite character, if you can believe it, before the first movie was released. So what happened? Well, I think you know where I'm going from here. If you think about it, it's pretty incredible how forgiving everyone was with the Harry Potter movies and what they did to Ron's character. But I just don't think that most of us had our eyes opened yet. I don't think that audiences, especially male audiences, knew that through Hermione, the beginning of character assassinations would start to happen. Characters from every single major franchise would be affected, and it all started right here, the Hermione bomb. Now you might be thinking, I understand what you're talking about with Ron's movie character versus his book character, but what does that have to do with Hermione? Well, my friend, indulge me for just a few more minutes while I explain. You see, in writing, there is a reason why they say 90% of writing is rewriting, and it's because most of what we write is garbage. Editing exists to strengthen the characters and the events that happen in the books we read and the movies that we watch. These stories are often refined to such a point that it's typically only a handful of events in a story that create the personality of each character. It only takes a few scenes and a few lines, for instance, to know what kind of character Bender is in the John Hughes classic The Breakfast Club.
Excuse me a second. What are you babbling about?
It's actually pretty easy to figure out each of these characters within the first 5 minutes of the film. What makes Ron's character in the books so incredible is the few moments where he showcases loyalty, bravery, and a pretty good moral standing when faced with difficult and dangerous situations.
Not me, not Hermione, you.
But that's the book. For whatever weird and self-righteous reason, the writer of the movie versions of the Harry Potter characters decided to take almost all of Ron's brave, moral, and loyal lines and actions and give them to Hermione instead.
For a man to like her best was arguably unusual.
That's right, somebody deliberately stole Ron's best and bravest moments and gave them to Hermione instead. It's a really weird thing to do. Unfortunately, today's cinema does this all the time, but I really do think that it all began right here with these movies. Not that the Mary Sue character didn't exist before, but that in a movie series that generated over $7 billion in a 10-year period, it's no surprise that the floodgates were open to write this kind of character in everything. What I'm trying to say is that the incentive had changed. The Hermione bomb signaled to studios and to screenwriters that the female characters no longer needed flaws and that their strengths can be at the expense of the male characters around them. The message seemed to be, make more Hermiones and you'll make billions. And we were blind. Not everybody, mind you, but the public at large was blind. You could even argue that Hermione is not a main character, so it's forgivable, because Harry is still the chosen one. That we got an on-screen series of movies that were taken seriously by a studio that created them. And we hadn't seen character assassinations of this kind to this level in a movie franchise before. That the audience can hardly be blamed. What happened to Ron's character and how it benefited Hermione is the standard issue of affairs in today's movies. I mean, she steals his lines in this scene, this one, this one, this one, and even in this one.
If you want to kill Harry, you'll have to kill us too.
And that's just scratching the surface. What made Hermione's character so good in the books is that she was flawed. But it wasn't just that she was flawed, but that she was flawed in the most feminine ways. She was emotional and easily hurt by the words and actions of her friends. She expected Ron to make the first move to romantically progress a relationship because there was this sense of traditionalism that existed in her personality. She becomes easily jealous of girls that she feels are better looking than her, and she still does petty things to those girls that she doesn't like. She's just like a normal high school girl. I always felt that her character was written in a way that only another woman could write. These movies, however, read more like a fan fiction, where the writer's placeholder fantasies for Hermione's character made it on screen. All of Ron's and Hermione's strengths roll in Hermione, while Ron gets left with only his flaws and Hermione loses all of hers. Like I said, these scenes were hardly discovered by me. People have noticed Ron's character assassination for 20 years, but I'm taking it a step further. The Hermione bomb changed cinema for the decades to come, because what was once a fringe trope hardly used in film, the Mary Sue character was now on full display in Harry Potter, and would be the foundation of storytelling in Hollywood until today. Once my brain connected the dots, I realized that there was no greater or more profitable success in film at the change of the millennium than the Harry Potter series. I mean, think about it. All the movies in the last 20 years that have come out, especially ones based on books, where the hero is put in extraordinary situations like a hopeless survival movie or a dangerous love story, are more often than not a Mary Sue story with a female lead. The success of Hermione is, from what I can tell, the single greatest catalyst that led to this insufferable phenomenon. While it might not seem like it at first, this is quite possibly the most controversial thing I've ever said on this channel. There is no such thing as a Gary Stu. Like I said, this doesn't seem like it's all that bad, but the core theory to my premise is actually pretty controversial by today's standards, and I'll tell you why in a minute. First, I wanted to get to the meat of this video. I started writing this video almost a year ago, and it is the most edited piece of writing I have ever created. Seriously, I didn't even edit this much in college. And it's because I really wanted to get it right. It's why I spent an entire chapter defining the term Mary Sue to begin with, and why I spent 2 chapters showing the last 40 years of cinema history that brought us to this point today. It's also why it took so long for this series to come out. For those of you that have been watching me for a while, you know that I've been talking about wanting to make a Mary Sue video for almost an entire year. The deeper that I dove into this subject, the more my mind started to recognize the flaws in the current consensus of the Mary Sue problem that we have in Hollywood. I mean, even more right-leaning channels seem to have it wrong. People, myself included, have continued to say the same old tired thing about the problem being poor writing, or even downright man-hating. And while all of these things are certainly true about Mary Sue's, it never really makes it into the mainstream that the Mary Sue is a Mary Sue at her core because she is a woman doing a man's job. Everything else, from being good at everything,
I walked through a radiation shielding barrier of a witch hex, and now I can manipulate and see all wavelengths of the electromagnetic spectrum,
to being loved by everyone, is a derivative to the core ingredient of a Mary Sue being a woman first. If this theory of mine is true, and I like to think that it is, then the Gary Stu, a male Mary Sue, doesn't actually exist. Let me explain. Star Wars, the greatest of all franchises, is one of the few places where a woman can be a hero and it be at least somewhat believable. In a world where Jedi exist, it's plausible that these monk-like heroes that are trained from a ridiculously young age and have magical abilities can have heroes that are women. Jedi are taken away from whatever life that they were going to lead to one of service and selflessness, and given their capabilities and the constant training, it is at least plausible that some of these heroes can be women. And therein lies the point. Star Wars is a meticulously crafted world with its own rules and a vast universe, and this creates an environment where such heroes can exist. However, in live action, this does seem to have its limits. While female Jedi have been in existence since the days of George Lucas, one thing Lucas never did was make a live-action story revolving around a female hero, or at least a female Jedi. This might add more to the controversy of what I'm saying, but I don't think that the original 6 movies would have been looked at with as much reverence as they do today had they been female heroes rather than the male heroes that we got. And I really do think that it's because it rings more objectively true to have heroes of stories that are men. This simply resonates more with all audiences, men and women alike. Now, to be clear, what I mean when I say hero is not the term used by writers to describe the hero of the story, the person in which the perspective of the story is told from. What I actually mean is the archetype of hero. You know, the hero in the traditional sense, like a knight, a soldier, or a gun-wielding badass set on a path of vengeance. Now, in a much more believable scenario of female heroics, we do have the aforementioned Ellen Ripley and Sarah Connor. From what I can tell, and believe me, I've done extensive research on the subject, these are the most widely accepted female heroes in all of action entertainment. I mean, most sci-fi fans, well, all fans actually, really agree on these two being awesome.
Show me everything. I can handle myself.
Now, while these 2 leading ladies are in action films, their action-packed and heroic exploits often have to be done with deception or overwhelming force. And it's always based off of a maternal need to protect their child, or adopted child, making their actions not only believable, but understandable. There really aren't that many examples of well-portrayed female heroes because most of what makes a Mary Sue is that she's a woman. Female heroes that we love from various movies and shows are loved because a world was built around a character to increase the believability of that female hero. This also says nothing about how their actions in these movies are mostly believable in a physical way as well.
Get away from her, you bitch!
Using that previously described deception and overwhelming force to achieve their goals is far more believable than this completely stupid kind of fight scene. I mean, I don't care how much training this little woman has, she's not stopping this many men of this size. It's just ridiculous. You see, at some point in Hollywood, we did cross over from believable, entertaining, and rare.
Look, man, I only need to know one thing. Where they are.
To ridiculous, pandering, and common, and whether people want to admit it or not, it's damaging to society to have our fictional entertainment reflect something that isn't objectively good or objectively true. The fictional world built around a modern-day female hero is a fully pandering one. Gone are the maternal instincts. Gone is the need for a woman to be helped by others, especially if those others are men. And gone are the subversive tactics that gave women the believable upper hand on their adversaries. Now women stand toe-to-toe with their male villains, and they defeat them at every turn with unbelievable force. There is no more trying to build a believable world where women must overcome the odds, but instead, they are the smartest, bravest, and most physically capable of everyone around them, and it's just so far removed from believability. But just as soon as audiences collectively started waking up to this phenomenon, another, almost seemingly planned phenomenon started to run parallel to the complaint about the Mary Sue, and that was the lie about Mary Sue's being both male and female. I know that many in my audience disagree with me when I say this, and I'm sure that I'm going to get some comments rebutting my stance, but writing is not the core problem to our Mary Sue situation. This right here is where I stand in complete contrast to popular channels like The Drinker, Star Wars Theory, and Jeremy Johns, and where I think they actually get it wrong. Let me explain. Before someone can write a screenplay or a book or even a video essay, there must be a series of steps that have to be achieved in order to get the words on the page. Someone's beliefs and morals must come first. What we believe matters, and what the very core of all of writing is a core understanding of what the writer believes is right and wrong, good and evil. As I said many times, fiction is a reflection of our society, so it shouldn't be a great mystery why our modern entertainment is mostly bad today, because it reflects a shallow and selfish society that ignores truth. After belief comes the idea. Now, you writers out there probably know what I'm talking about when I say this, but in my opinion, there are basically two types of writers. The one that has an idea and creates a brainstorm, an outline, and a first draft before completing the final product. And then there are those that simply sit at the keys and start punching.
Punch the keys, for God's sake!
Either way, there is an idea that sparks in the writer's mind. Now, where this idea comes from is a very interesting debate, but in my opinion, it's probably from what Jung called the collective unconscious, or maybe a more modern and shallow understanding of the term, the subconscious. Regardless, the idea begins the writing, and what comes next is how someone's beliefs affect the story they're telling. The behaviors of the hero and the villains, and the interactions with the world around them have to be built by someone, and that someone has their own beliefs. I mean, there is no such thing as a neutral telling of the story, by the way, because the story must be built by the confines of the writer's beliefs in what is ultimately good and ultimately evil. Without it, the story has no structure or message, and without that, there's no purpose to the story. This doesn't even get into the next steps, which is what I actually think most people are talking about, which is writing capability and the mastery of the language. But at the core of all writing, first comes someone's personal beliefs, their understanding of good and evil, their understanding of objective truth. And one of those truths is that men and women are very different creatures. At our biological foundation, we are so different, in fact, that it creates an environment around us that shapes our future and the makeup of our decision-making process. This means that down to the very core of our physical and psychological self, we will make decisions based on all of those factors. It's why the majority of real-life heroics are done by men. It's why women often choose certain career fields that are less stressful than men do. It's why, despite rabid feminism, fashion and home design still continues to exist. It's why so many TikTok and Instagram videos come out where women learn that they don't think anything like men do.
Once a week, how do you not think about the Roman Empire? Basically everything that you know and love is because of the Roman Empire.
To get back on topic, this means that heroics would also be different in stories because men and women are different in the real world. There is a difference between a heroine and a hero, and a difference in what makes them heroic. What I'm trying to convey is that a hero's journey is going to be different for a man than it is for a woman because our understanding of those heroic steps requires a gendered component to make it heroic for that character. Some great examples of this can be seen in the Greek mythos, where the traditional archetypal characters are represented in their most extreme versions. Hera is the caregiver, a role that is typically a very feminine role in modern storytelling, like an archetypal mother. Both Artemis and Athena are known for their virginity and, as such, their purity. Aphrodite, the lover, is often associated with pleasure, seduction, and procreation. These ideas are completely feminine, and their heroics, tragedies, and overall stories run along those lines of their feminine traits. Now, as I said in the first chapter, there is a difference between archetypes and tropes. The Mary Sue, is a deliberate type of story that can only exist as a feminine one because the prerequisite for the trope is that she's a woman doing a man's hero's journey. Having said this, a man can be good at everything and be loved by everyone and it still not be a Gary Stu because he's a man in a man's journey. Instead of being a trope that is deliberately made to buck the system, a man that is good at everything and is loved by everyone is simply a poorly written hero. It's not the same thing because he belongs there in the first place. Connor and Ripley are great heroines, but it's because they are maternal. And by the way, their first movies weren't even heroic movies, but rather survivor thrillers where both make it because of the sacrifices of those around them. It's more like a horror film where you just want the damsel to survive. The heroics come later, and are heroics because they do heroic things to save their son and adopted daughter. It's a message that can be identified with across all political and religious lines. We can all admire the heroism of these stories. But every single Aliens and Terminator movie after Aliens and Terminator 2 are considered awful for a reason. The universally accepted story was gone. While the writing is bad, the core problem to the Mary Sue trope is the beliefs held by the writers of these stories, not the writing itself. The Mary Sue trope is a deliberate type of story meant to place women in male roles, in male stories, and create a false sense of reality to explain how she's heroic. As such, a man cannot be a male Mary Sue or Gary Stu because he's supposed to be there in the first place. Men that have what is commonly referred to as Mary Sue traits are not Gary Stews, but are simply poorly written heroes. Okay, let's get something straight. I don't hate women. As a matter of fact, I don't even blame women for this phenomenon at all. The strong female character, while the point of this video is merely a symptom of an overall problem within Western society, the inability in our cultural discourse to accept objective reality as a foundation in order to achieve a logical conclusion. One of those conclusions, no matter how politically incorrect it may be to say, is that gender roles are real. This doesn't mean that there can't be strong female characters in movies, but that they need to be realistic and rare and typically an archetype that is feminine, like their more believable counterparts from the 80s and 90s. Heroic stories of danger and violence need to appeal to the very audience that would normally undertake such a journey in the first place. In other words, men. Men and women are different, no matter what media wants us to believe, and we do have different roles in society that we choose to undertake of our own free will. Our stories should help to encourage that difference because no matter how much some people might want that to change, it never will. Now, I want to end this by saying that my message may be about typically female characters, but my message isn't towards women. Now, it's true that there are women writers and directors out there, and executives too, I guess, that make Mary Sue stories, but ultimately it's still men's fault for doing it. Male executives are still the makeup of most corporations, and they still make the bulk of action movies and shows. Not to mention that if gender roles exist, it's our job to lead by example, so we do bear the brunt of the blame. Men are men, and women are women. And no amount of fictional hoop jumping is going to change that. I'm the Germexican, and I hope that I've earned your subscription today. Tell me what you think in the comments. Thanks for watching. God bless, and I'll see you next time.